Hello. This is my first video on my YouTube channel, and I have a really cool guest to kick it off with. His name is Shaun Berke. He's a really great painter. You should go check out what he does at shaunberke.com. Shaun, thank you for being with us. So we were just talking about mythology, and you said that there were pitfalls to over mythologizing your life. Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, well, thank you for having me on your channel, and I'd like to also say thank you to Johannes at the Halkyon Guild for connecting us. So yeah, mythology is wonderfully informative, and it can be very guiding in its storytelling. The reason why all these stories live on is because they have value in them for all of us to learn from and make our choices according to that. And yeah, the perils in over mythologizing factor into perhaps ego and shadow combating for some dominance. Already thinking into our our story of Narcissus peering into the waters and getting in, and so enraptured and enchanted with that, that there's nothing that Echo can do to pull the character away. And that's in some proximity to the painting that you mentioned of Odin at Mimir as well, because it does feature myself as the painter working on a picture. You have a limited number of resources when you're, say, out in the woods, and you're determining how to compose a painting, and using such a reflective lake to bring some of these philosophical and psychological ideas up from the depths that are kind of encapsulated in mythology.
Yeah, I mean, I always thought it was interesting how we fantasize about being gods when we read mythology. We fantasize about having sort of this privileged access to the heights of reality and wisdom and beauty. And it's funny that when we over-identify with these gods, we recoil in terror, because I think all our Catholic upbringing comes back and is beware of pride, and beware of this desire to be like gods. C.S. Lewis says that the devils love to disguise themselves in angels of light, and I think we all have an intuition of this sort of this Faustian madness that can go incredibly awry as soon as we try to become gods ourselves. So that's
and
yeah, please.
And yeah, Faust is at a particular juncture in transition of pagan morality into a more Christian valuation. So that's when these very profound shifts that we bear in mind as we revisit these old stories. They're different worlds, entirely entirely different worlds. As we compare one story to another, we do see how different peoples have adapted, but not to digress from how we relate to the gods is a very, very important point to bear in mind in an age of such unbridled hubris. As we dominate the planet, we take every resource that we need to further our species, as any species is is compelled to do. But it is akin to The Flight of Icarus, a short essay by Bertrand Russell on Icarus draws a parallel for the hubris that we find ourselves in propagation of unmitigated reason. But so yeah, it's something to take with a grain of salt, but there's a lot of value in all these old stories. That's why they live on.
Mm. Yeah, it's something Heidegger said, that in the modern age, what replaced piety and religion was what he called a psychological analysis of mythology. So that was one of the symptoms of modernity that he pointed out. He said there was a concern for art as being aesthetic, an aestheticization of art, and the psychological investigation of myth. So he says those are your two sort of secular pillars for spirituality that still remain in the modern age. What do you think of that?
Oh, that is yeah, that's very close to a point that Mircea Eliade brings up in Myth and Reality, talking about how these myths have survived in their rationalization, and so as oral tradition gets put down and becomes written canon, it became necessary to piggyback these stories onto their moral lessons, and that's why they carry on. And so it's becomes overly classified, and it does somewhat of a disservice to the multivalent truths that they once conveyed to different bands of people. Yeah, but they do serve as pillars. That's no mistake. In an age without any predominant faith, we do see that want filled in consumerism.
Yeah.
No, so it was a battle for our kind, isn't it?
Sorry?
It's always a battle for our kind in
Yeah.
pursuing the meaning and purpose that that we are trying to justify our existence, and which brings us back to aesthetics, where that in itself is, as Nietzsche puts it, is the only justification for existence.
Yeah, it's true. He believes that. I don't know what to make of this, because I was very much a product of the modern age, the modern zeitgeist, so to speak. Like all of those things that I denounce, I once very much embodied. I used to be quite a physicalist. I used to be quite a nihilist. I used to be quite an unbridled hedonist and a pagan. And then I went to university and I studied philosophy, and I, if not completely changed my mind on these subjects, at least heavily nuanced them. And I'm at a point today where I think that making artists into the priests of modernity is not necessarily the right way to go, because they do extract intensity out of the universe and present it to us. They do intensify a relationship to reality. But present artists especially don't guide us in the direction necessarily of that which is valuable. I mean, I was walking around in the Tate Modern the other day with a friend, and I was just struck how there was a lot of paintings that were technically quite masterful, I mean, they were painted by someone who knew how to paint, and there were beautiful colors, and quite an eye. But what was depicted was itself ugly. It only denounced. It didn't edify. It could only. The truth of it was bitter, as opposed to sweet. And I think when art does that, I think it's failed you. I think art, if it doesn't edify, it fails you. If it can only denounce and not uplift, it's not doing its job. And that's what most art is today, I think. And a lot of revered art, it's just extremely witty irony, or extremely well thought out nihilism, extremely well depicted sort of jest and contempt for old ideals. How does that help us, really? How does that help us out of the nihilism of the contemporary age?
And that's a great question, because at bottom it doesn't. the difference between irony and sentimentality is a huge canyon. And part of the distinction that some traditional painters, I'm thinking of the Nerdrum school, have gone to lengths to describe a sort of cultural speciation, as I refer to it, drawing the distinction between art and kitsch, with the intention towards identifying works of irony and works more sentimental. And that it's worth making that classification, that distinction, because it's true. There are so many folks that will go to a museum and not make heads or tails of a work that brings some cold hard truths to bear, revealing just how listless and vacuous the world of contemporary art and fashion and design shows itself to be. And it's so that self-awareness feels like it's clever. And believe me, I've understood this fairly thoroughly, coming from one of the top shelf schools of art and design. And it's very shallow in its values. It doesn't go back much more than a few decades, when we might have a longer view of culture across centuries. And these are our broadest categorizations, because you might have a very heartfelt work in a contemporary installation that compiles a mother's bowling records, and after her passing, it becomes its entirely own representation of a life lived, and the person went through the trouble of remembering them, compared to perhaps a work technically masterful but somewhat shallow. There's plenty of room for error on either side of these categories, but one does need to also then be careful of writing, the rules for a new school. I'm remembering an article in Art News where there's a long list of rules for contemporary artists to follow. And this is sometime after you have another revolutionary's idea, where I'm referring to Wagner's essay on art and religion, where he recognizes the loss of value and symbolism in culture. And so, coming back around to your point about the pillars of a society, any one would-be visionary might direct some pillars that are conducive to what they believe to be the merits to uphold a culture, and then it becomes another dictate. So the correlation at bottom, the correlation between art and religion has a lot to unpack in itself. And I wonder as to that visit in the Tate Modern. I preferred spending more time in Tate Britain when I was visiting.
So do I.
Looking at I was looking at some of the pre-Raphaelite work and appreciating some of this technique and the stories, and it's all on the surface of the painting, and it doesn't have to be accompanied by a thesis, and that there's a lot of value in that in itself.
Yeah. When it comes to British painting, of course, I like the pre-Raphaelites, and I like Turner, and I like Blake, and that's about it. Like, I'm not. I think there's a lot of it that's, meh, little old lady-ish.
Yeah.
If you know what I mean, like old lady-ish. It's a yeah.
I couldn't. I definitely know what you mean. And I really love both Turner and Rodin for maybe some of the more recent masters. To your point of the old ladyish paintings, it can be just as soul draining as going through a contemporary art museum. And I realized that one time some years ago now when visiting a Huntington Library, and the collection has like a Sargent painting, but most of it is a trudge through these turgid paintings. It's just one big flower vase and fluffy family after another until you want to vomit. And I realized I couldn't be around paintings that were so draining, and it starts to fill in too many poor qualities. Keeping an eye on gold standards that, as one defines them for themselves, helps to keep an eye on what it is that really does bring that uplifting quality to painting. It's a large task. Referring back to your earlier point of, so the task would then be to uplift. So the task of a painting and
art in general, movies, any art, if for me, should be edifying, because otherwise I don't see the point. I think it's if you're going to make art for a large public and you have a following, people who look to you to help them, to edify them, to lead them, because that's what artists do today, more than before when they were just craftsmen. And I don't mean that with despondency, like or with contempt, but they were considered craftsmen, not these half in the ether priests as we consider them today. So today, if the artists are the priest of the modern age, they should assume the mantle with a little more reflection and a little less irony and despondency. I think that's where I'm coming from. We invest them with so much authority. That should come with the responsibility to guide towards that which is worthwhile. Which is, that's not just someone crying alone in the dark. I think a lot of art is that. It's tears made into whatever, communicated through whatever medium, and not.
And
yeah, so that's what I'm.
That's an important distinction to make, and there's a particular transition though from being regarded as craftsmen and artisans and masters of a particular trade. I actually hold that in higher regard than the priesthood of art, as that becomes its own facade of celebrity, and that is what enables such an irresponsible display of a concept. So you know, you might compare how Damien Hirst will cut a mother and calf in half down the middle, put them in formaldehyde, put them on display to talk about the separation of a mother and child, when we might compare that to the time spent so so we're going back to prehistory, a hunter carving a laughing hyena on the head of an atlatl as not only means of their own survival, but crafting this appreciation for the thing that brings them life. And when we dig into the responsibility that art with a capital A has for a society, we are in the territory of Hegel and the responsibility of the dawn of a new day. And then we have to be careful that what that in itself unfolds, because contemporary art has been defined by Kant and Hegel. And that's what leads us into such a condition of works based on theory or diegesis, the critical theory that dissects and takes apart everything to no end. And it is, as you say, no help. And
yeah,
I find it necessary to go back to its origin. So, because you mentioned about you mentioned the responsibility of art in uplifting and drawing the parallel towards the priesthood. That comes from the very roots of and the dawn of humankind. I mean, cave painting.
Yeah, it's very important that we not lose touch with this. Like I spent this past week just reading a bunch of C.S. Lewis books, getting reacquainted with him, because I'd only ever just read Narnia as a kid. But he was a very prolific writer and a great Christian apologist, and I knew that he wrote all of these Christian allegories. So I wanted to take a crack at them, and they're wonderful. They're really quite wonderful. He really is good at conjuring up the mood of paradise for you, so that you almost feel like you're at its door. And when you're finished reading it, you put down the book and you think, wow, I really want to be a better person. Like whatever the hero has found in this book, I want to find it as well. I want whatever moment of catharsis, whatever grand revelation that has saved him, I want to be saved like he's been saved. So they're all extremely edifying books, and they're written by someone who wants to save people, who wants them to give them the means to save themselves. That's beautiful to me and valuable. And I think that that's what I look for in art. That's what I've always looked for in art without really knowing it. I grew up right next to the Louvre as a kid. For 14 years. It was 5 minutes away by foot. So I would go all the time, and I'd hang out, especially in the Renaissance Gallery. It was my favorite part. And what's funny about the Renaissance Gallery is I must have walked through it dozens of times, and it was always a different walk. I never once. It's not like I had my favorites that I would always go see. Different things would pop out on different days at me. There's so many paintings, the Renaissance Gallery, they're all like packed together. It's and it's a really long gallery. So every time you went, it was something different. Especially once, I remember there was a tiny Raphael. It's like the size of a postcard. And it was Saint George killing the dragon, I think, with a spear. And there was this vision of hell, and it was so gorgeous and mesmerizing. I must have hypnotically stared at it for an hour and a half, really just fascinated with it. And I mean, it's so easy to miss that painting. It's tiny, it's tucked away, it's given no prominence whatsoever in the exhibit. Uh, but it's a hidden gem, you know. It's lovely. Have you ever been to the Renaissance Gallery in the Louvre?
Yeah, I was spellbound with the whole 2-day visit. It's all too common, I'd say, overlooking some of the smaller, more quiet works in such a large collection. It draws attention to the difference from this day and age and the time when it was painted, where we're over inundated with imagery, right? Everything from advertisements to subjecting ourselves to feeds, strapping them on like a feed bag. Consume content is one way to inoculate oneself from a more quiet and subtle and slow beauty. And that stands in contrast for our time and the Renaissance, where that kind of visual communication spoke volumes for a society less literate or with fewer readers in the society. And regarding your point about the edification in reading about some legend or hero in whichever category, pagan or Christian, C.S. Lewis does carry on values from in a particular tradition. And in mythology, it becomes its own realm from which we create these idols, and they become their own comic books and movies. And what we have today for our myths is at least some continuation. Right?
I mean,
Some of the old stories, I think, address some of our deepest nature that we still don't quite confront.
mm. Well, do you know about in mythology, how there are different ages, and every myth that belongs to that age has a different feel to it? You know, the creation myths are what's there in the creation is like one or two, maybe three extremely potent entities, extremely powerful. There's the creator god, there's the waters of chaos, and then there's the word, right? So that's a very different story than like when you get to Cain and Abel, where they're farmers and there's a small community at least around. And so I think like what you see is in the first age myths, the things are extremely potent and metaphysical. They're metaphysical or kinds of myths. And then you move on to the creation of the world and how it's ruled by a pantheon of gods, usually rebelling against the first titans, the waves of titans. There's this conquering of sort of elemental forces and the establishing of the world, wherein which men will eventually rise up and be the playthings of the gods. And those are different age myths. So the Kronos, that's first age, you would say. Then all the misadventures of the gods would be second age, and then by the time you get to the Odyssey, this third age, and then after the Odyssey is fourth age. It's all the heroes coming home and destroying their families, and great tragedies. And the gods are further away. They keep receding further and further away. So I think we might be in the position of almost like a fifth age, where our stories are extremely complex, but its heroes have lost all the potency or all the mana. It's redistributed across too many things, institutions, people of importance, actors, artists, founders of countries, politicians. The mana is like multi-fractured, and the stories are very complex, but they resonate in a way that's indefinable, abstract, almost nothing, you know? Because in a way, like when you think about it, the creation of a country, let's say America, is a myth. Like the founding fathers are heroes. You know, they're supposed to be closer to some sort of golden age of the Enlightenment, and the fathers of the Enlightenment, Hume and John Locke and Adam Smith, all those guys are the, you know, the mystagogues and thinkers and birthed the idea of America. That's it. That's a myth. That's about as clear a myth as I can see it. You know, so some especially for the Americans, but it's not quite Hermes and Apollo and the gods, the sea gods and the Maenads, and it's not seeped in the magic of older myths, and in the cosmic importance of even older myths. You know, even.
And and that's very right. Every nation requires its fiction to bind the people together. I'm reminded of the through line that we see from even to choose a word for, say, for the UK, and you can parse that down to Britain, or you know, the Britons being the different people from the people who occupy the place called Britain now. But tracing the whether stories of from the Mabinogion for a guide for some people, or cultural history for some people, or the melding of people under King Arthur, the fictions of uniting disparate peoples, connecting that to Rome and to Romulus and Remus, through to Aeneas in with Ovid, and then we go back then to Greece and Theogony and Hesiod, connecting from Kemet or Egyptian culture, and branching off, earlier from it's a bramble of cultural histories, right? Where and then into the Middle East and East with the Enuma Elish and the Vedas, all of these stories having very particular cultural values to particular peoples. One of the things I wanted to respond to about the different ages of man is a speculation into the mists of history that can only ever really remain speculation, but it's in the category of euhemerism. When you read so many stories about other races or ages of man, and you discover so many different species of human, and you'll find some very, very particular things, say from the Iliad, the Song of Ilium, and in contest, it might have been from the funeral celebration in lifting and throwing stones, and they have a very specific measurement for the weight of a stone, and how in one age a hero could lift this quantity or weight or whatever. And so then you think about some of the more robust species of human that had lived prior to us and our adaptation. And I think that's worth speculating on, because the stories that we carry on tell of our victories, and that's, to put it succinctly, history being, written by the victor. But, yeah. So Raphael's painting in the Louvre, that was a particular favorite.
Yeah, I loved it. It really jumped out at me. It's funny. my relationship to art's a bit weird because so many times, I contemplate so much great art feeling like I don't have the tools to understand it. And there's this frustration that arises that I'm not piercing in to its core, that I'm only scratching the surface of it. I get this especially in classical music, listening to a great work of classical music, and I know that I'm not in the holy inner sanctum of it because I don't understand it, because I haven't really trained my mind to understand it that way. So a lot of the art that I see produces frustration in me. And sometimes it just jumps out and, I don't know, it brings me to tears, really, or makes me shake or tremble. When it does bubble up, it's always very, very, very intense. So that's how I would say most of my relationship to art happens. It's great to think that I'm one of those people who trusts that the Western intellectual canon has put forth things that are worthy of consideration. I'm not a postmodern who wants to destroy like all old valuing systems. I believe in Rembrandt and the Renaissance. I believe in classical music. I believe in all of that. I think the way I see it, you can see anything as beautiful with the right aesthetic gaze. It's an effort that you make. Anything that you look at could be beautiful, seen the right way. In a way, because it's all meaningful in some sort of sense. My dad, I'll explain what I mean. My dad had a really crazy existential crisis. He was walking in Paris once, and I think he was hungover or something, and he was walking by the river, and he saw a half-eaten, dejected can of beans, and he just had like an existential fear creep up, because he saw in this, it was probably eaten by some vagrant, and it was in a beautiful place, and there was something tragic about that. How something so beautiful that should be paradise could be the, I don't know, the stage for something so tragic as a vagrant's life, you know. So it was something like that. It was something in that paradox, I guess, that like really struck him and made him shake, and put him in a very elevated mood that whole day. And I think that was by accident, but I think that you can train yourself to see the importance in any part of the cosmos, because it's all related, it's all beautiful in some way. But it's an effort. It's an effort that you need to make. And people don't like to make efforts. They'd rather keep them to a minimum. So what I think the intellectual authority does is that it puts forth things which are worthy of this effort. They say these things more than others, if you make this spiritual effort of trying to extract beauty from it, there's more in here than in other pieces to extract. What do you think of that? Do you think that there are certain works that are just more charged with mana, or you could put it that way, than others, or is everything as good as anything else and it's all a matter of taste?
No, some works are certainly more charged than others. And the example with your father is such a necessary confrontation for some very human evidence of some very real human suffering in an unexpected context. Part of that mandate, that the category of art as what we see as okay, how let me rephrase frame this for a moment. The notion that art must convey its moral responsibility comes from Kant and Hegel. It has shaped the conditions and as a necessary reaction towards works too empty. But more to the core of what you're talking about, there's not beauty in everything. It's necessary to confront the ugly, and the effort to see beauty in anything is the province of postmodernism. And the reason why I say there isn't beauty in everything is because that is what I observe in any metropolis emerging over a thick smog, and the really ill-informed geometry that decorates this architecture speaks to a lack of understanding. It speaks to a lack of meaning, and that's why I'm pretty well set on the roots of beauty that underlies all human works. Now, and so what I'm referring to is an evolutionary, I should say maybe a coevolution with beauty. That's what I'm driving at. There's a coevolution of beauty where we determine something is a little bit more cathartic or brings a little bit more solace for reasons that we don't need to explain. So when you go to Notre Dame, when it's rebuilt, renovated, fixed up after it's burning, and you listen to a mass, you don't have to have read anything. You don't have to understand any of the monastic practices or secular devotions that are not secular devotions. Any of the devotional sermons that they're singing, just to be in that architecture with that that light and sounds of those chants, the smell of myrrh, is an inherently transcendent experience because they've been tuning into that more elevating sense in everything from the construction of the space to to this sights and smells and sounds that surround some of the thoughts that are uplifting. So contemporary culture should pay mind to the traditions that have been a little bit more fulfilling, even if we're beyond all of that now.
I don't think we'll ever get beyond them. I think that people don't realize what they owe. People in the West don't realize what they owe to Christianity or the Judeo-Christian tradition. That if they reject it, they've built themselves around it by rejecting just that. It's inescapable. You live within a culture. If you grew up in the West, I grew up in France. It's a Christian country. So my problems are Christian. My struggles are Christian struggles. I studied Buddhism because I was fascinated with it in university. I took as many Buddhism classes on Buddhism as I could. And I flirted with the idea of becoming a Buddhist. But I'm still today kind of tormented by the idea that Buddhism is something that I've constructed all on my own. None of my environment ever conveyed Buddhism to me. So I feel like I wouldn't be building on something I already have. I'd be trying to grasp for something that might be a complete sort of artificial construction of mine. And that worry was echoed in Jung. Jung talks about that. He says, if you're a Westerner, certainly try to learn from Buddhism, but don't try to become a Buddhist yourself. Like, you can't, because your answers weren't Buddhists, and your neighbors weren't Buddhist, and your inner the architecture of your values is different. The metaphysical assumptions on which everyone you know speaks is different. So don't really try to navigate too much outside of what you have already been passed down, is what he advised. What do you think of that? Do you think that it should be a free for all? That, like, if you tried to become, like a follower of Odin, do you think that would have as much value as hearkening back to your Christian roots?
Cultural identification is a large question for everyone themselves to answer. The correlation between Middle Eastern religion and Eastern philosophy is more substantial than we might grant at the outset. So it makes perfect sense to dig a little bit further into the past for the Judeo-Christian faiths, because it is informed by a particular Orientalism that supports self-abnegation. And that is a distinctly different branch of humanity that has dominated the world. And it reminds me of how a small, out-of-the-way, rustic pagan faith of the Slavonic people is trodden over and only vaguely remembered for its small domestic deities, when at bottom it is another religion of fire worship, Svarog and the son of the sun, and all of these quaint pagan beliefs that get dismissed as just being too primitive. So I do want to clarify some of the ideas that surround paganism, because there's such a surge of interest, but it's a good direction to be in. One should take care to not overly romanticize and understand the distinction between a reenactment and a revival. As the myths become canon, we get these characters that we call Odin. I mean, he is a figure with 200 names across as many cultures that has migrated along with the stories. Beneath the roots of pagan beliefs are animistic ones. And that is a very particularly, it's very particular in that it's contrary to the anthropocentric views of the religions that dominate today. So the further back we go into these different belief systems, we start to see, as you're aware, these common roots in comparative religion, comparative mythology, and all of that. So identifying with identifying with any one story is only ever a surface valuation, and it's important to at least bear in mind how exploring that territory is a necessary contrast for an entirely different moral landscape. So it makes perfect sense um, for a Christian culture to explore its correlations to Buddhism, and I see that as being another category of entirely another metaphysical category. It brings self-abnegation because we divine powers from beyond. Whereas in the category of paganism and animism, they are within. And that's a critical distinction at the core of humanity. And when I say it comes from within, I mean there's soul in the elements. There's soul in the tree that is chopped down to burn, or the animal that you kill to eat to live.
And you say Buddhism doesn't have that? You're saying Buddha as opposed to Buddhism or Hinduism?
I'm the distinction that I mean to make between pagan and Christian belief is that in pagan belief you have powers drawn from within and from this world, and in the Judeo-Christian beliefs they are from without. And then by extension, then there are some, and it's a limited connection to Buddhism and Hinduism, because they are their own distinct categories, distinct philosophies and spiritualities. But the commonality that I'm drawing attention to between Christianity and Buddhism is essentially self-abnegation.
Mm. Yeah, but the negating of the self is yeah, it's very characteristic of monistic religions, any religions of the one, because any religion that's unified in essence, then you're one too many. It can't be you and God. It's God and you in some mysterious way that you don't understand. You're unified. The two becomes one in a way that you don't really, that's very mystifying to you. And that requires a willful act of death. It requires that you die willingly, as opposed to being taken kicking and screaming, that you willingly die for the sake of union. That's, I think, what it is, which is the most unnatural thing to do biologically. Like all your body does is protect you from death at every moment. All your stories, all your moral compass, like the world, it's all geared towards avoiding death. So the idea that you should die willingly is very very mysterious and demands incredible justification. Like what's to be gained, and what's to be gained is paradise, salvation, everything. And what's to be lost is everything. It's an all or nothing kind of game. So I think those are the most difficult of all, because what paganism allows you to do is to pick an area of life that you enjoy. Let's say it's art, or let's say that it's combat and victory, or let's say that it's success and thriving, right? And you get to worship it, and you get to spiritualize it. You get to spiritualize that which you're already sort of predisposed to enjoy and I think a lot of people get intoxicated. It's like paganism is sort of like a spiritual mead, which enhances uh, the areas of life that you find valuable. I think I see it that way, at least. Um, so
That
by all means, drink of the mead, but I think that it's more valuable when it's geared towards an ultimate arc project. You don't see things as ends in themselves. For instance, uh, art to me is valuable in as much as it edifies me. Philosophy is valuable in as much as it makes me a better person, as it keeps me thinking and keeps me striving in the right direction. Uh, but the direction is what's important, not the means. And so I think your all of your musings and all of your paganism can serve you, but only if you use it towards a grander project. Call it salvation,
I I would be wary of the end in salvation, and perhaps instead towards self-mastery. And where you began with that thread was reminding me of the roots of meaning and the origin of religions in primitive cultures. And so I'm thinking of fire worship in particular. That's where we have unity. There's the one sun, and that has given rise to so many different fractals of beliefs that it has come to mean a lot of different things for a lot of different peoples. But one of the unifying aspects for a particular people is in the works that a people comes together to construct. So whether that's the temple at the Acropolis, the center of Athens, or if it's a tree throw that becomes what we know as is constructed as a megalith, Stonehenge, and similar stoneworks that require a tremendous amount of coordination and effort for a whole society to realize what it is that is most important, most edifying and uplifting for themselves and their progeny. There's a lot to be careful of with regard to salvation, because that is a conclusion when we grant that our existence is in some form a sin itself. And the notion of addiction to salvation, I think that had come up in reading Dostoevsky, and he examines that much more thoroughly, much more in depth. But it's worth bearing in mind what behaviors of ours lead us to think of that and think that we are driven towards salvation. And one adjacent point to all of this actually is pattern recognition. One of the things that we're specialized in, and one of the lenses that we hold up in comparing mythologies. So pattern recognition is underlying all of these things that we're talking about, whether we relate ourselves to a particular story where we might draw lines between one end or another. Yeah.
But I came to believe in salvation. Salvation's a very religious concept. It's a very religious thing. It's not. So I was never religious, as I said. I grew up a physicalist, an atheist. I was caught up in scientism. And what really changed my mind radically was all my experiences with psychedelics in university. I think that's what it is for a lot of people that brings them to at least a notion of the holy. But what struck me was there were moments where it seemed that what I wanted to know as a philosopher was answered, and I knew it. And whatever it is that the philosopher wants to know can be known in some. There is a state where it's known. And what I remember is that not really what I knew, because I'm not in it anymore, but more what it felt like to know it, what it was like to know it. And what it was like to know it was kind of what religious people describe. It wasn't thought, it was just known very personally. And it made you, contrite isn't even the right word, it's made you repentant. It made you repentant. It brought you to your knees, in some sense. What the philosopher wants to know, if he knew it, would be brought to his knees. The weaker philosopher, the one with the weaker mind, would immediately want to forget it, would want to drink the waters of Lethe and just wash his hands of it. And the brave soul will contemplate it. My image of religious fervor has been altered forever. And I also know that when you're closer to this religious mood, the world is so beautiful and meaningful. And because your suffering is so potent and tragic, the light that comes to save you is all the more ethereal, all the more beautiful, all the more soothing and lulling. And you feel the kindness of the universe at its highest, as well as its harshness. And there's something for me about that which I think is profoundly true. And now the question becomes, how is it that I achieve those moods without drugs? What kind of life must I live so that I can experience that mood more often, with increasing and with and feeling less and less anxious about it? I think that's what it is. I think that like the religious insight, when it comes to someone who's not living correctly, comes as condemnation, as a condemning voice. But that exact same position in the cosmos, lived from the point of view of someone who's virtuous, is felt as salvation. Is felt as the great relief, that you can let your burden down, that you've done right by the cosmos, that you have, in a way, fulfilled the reason for your existence, which is for me the deepest of my anxieties. I think like there's nothing that terrifies me more than that, like the Egyptian, when you die and your soul is weighed on the scales with the feather. For me to fail that test is my greatest fear in life, I think. And I can't help but be tied to the idea of salvation. And in a way, it's what keeps me striving towards what I think is valuable. If I didn't believe in salvation, I wouldn't bother with reading all this mythology and this religion and this metaphysics. And I think I would focus on pleasure and making money and women and cocaine and clever conversations about the times, because that's what I was drawn to before I got interested in all of this. So in a way, to not believe in salvation, to think that it's not possible or that it's a pipe dream, is to commit your life to something less than what it could be. That's what I've come to believe at this present time.
And okay, so, and that is certainly a worthy end. I do see how it is inextricably bound towards the framework set from Christianity. And I say that with reverence towards Dostoevsky's Christianity. He goes into all the depths of making the necessary distinctions when you might use the term Dostoevsky's Christianity. But more importantly for me is to understand what it means to live after the death of God, after the death of gods. And I'm reminded of Emerson after, in the same spirit of the Romantic movement in reconnecting to a more naturalistic species of spirituality. Emerson was dried out from the church, and he reassigned deification to the god nature with the capital N. And that's the tendency of mankind to take a knee in view of something greater than themselves, which is respectable and admirable in its own way, but it does negate the divinity in one's self and the life that was granted. So the phrase that grounds a lot of this thought is from Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra, when the old saint in the forest meets Zarathustra as Zarathustra is going to the marketplace after having left the cave. And the saint in the forest tells him how he's going to remain in the wood. He sings to his gods, and he weeps, and he enjoys just the immediacy of that experience. And he says that he's forever a bird among birds and a bear among bears. And while we have obviously more agency and therefore more responsibility than birds and bears, I find it to be guiding in the lack of deification that a bird or a bear exhibits. There are no altars that bears construct, and maybe save for a tree rub. And for all the heights that birds soar to, there's nothing greater than an eagle's nest on the summit. And what more needs to be understood than that, and from my point of view. And the salvation that humanity is inclined towards kicks the can down the road, and I think that it might be sought after in any other form, whether or not the technological singularity is in the cards, as it looks like it still may be. That's just another iteration of a long delayed salvation. And so I approach that with some caution, but at the same time, that's not to undermine or depreciate any of those very profound experiences that they talk about, because I have had so many similar experiences, and to me, there's not, maybe I don't seek salvation so much as silence.
That's a form of salvation. Like when you hold up silence as holy, you recognize implicitly a life built around achieving true silence in the holy sense. That's what I mean. It's that anything that you value as something that will bring you a closer contact with something which is holy and divine, then that implies a life that's lived well so as to lead to that, or poorly so as to lead away from that. I think that's inescapable. What Christianity does, in my opinion, is that it gives you an ideal that's almost impossible to follow. It's so difficult. The path is so straight and narrow, and the temptations are so great, and the forces that stand in your way are so difficult to overcome that they give you a particularly difficult path. The Buddhists give you an incredibly difficult path. All great religions, as I see them, are great by virtue of giving you a path incredibly difficult to follow. I really believe that the great moral dichotomy, this is a thought I've been toying with these past few weeks, that the great moral dichotomy is not between right and wrong or good and evil, but between easy and difficult. That is always really the conflict. That I'm always most guilty of sloth and laziness and lack of fervor, lack of focus, lack of one-pointedness. So, yeah, the difficulty. Great religions are really difficult to align oneself with. I think that's why they're greater than paganism, because paganism, and I don't, when I say paganism, I mean paganism as it is experienced by people in the post-death of God age, not paganism as it was worshipped by the people of old. Paganism for you and I, when we contemplate as intellectuals Greek mythology or Norse mythology, that's a form of sort of modern paganism. That's the one I mean by when I use the word. Religions are greater than that, what that can give, because they're much more difficult to align oneself with. I think that's what it is. It demands a superhuman effort to have the humility to die willingly and to not think of oneself as all that important, but to think of oneself as supremely important at the same time. You know, how does that not? How is that not a pitfall for vanity and pride? It's almost an impossible project. The project of religion for me. Do you not see it that way? You see it differently.
Well, I do see how it is another impossible task, because it is, as I see it, against human nature.
Exactly.
We have fallen from grace and we continue to suffer for it. And where the Christian faith does hold psychological underpinnings that are very helpful guides. I'm thinking of in the categories, these themes of walled gardens, mother and child, the awareness, beyond, into the unknown lands, this, a sight for snakes, all of these primeval underpinnings have qualities in them that help us to understand ourselves. But similar to how philosophies might start in one area and conclude something that you might not be in accord with, religions will do the same thing because they've sprouted from the same source. And I see Christianity as a faith, as it's the worship of a death god and a betrayal of life, in that willingness towards transcending and being judged in another life, another world. And that sells everything we experience short. It undermines the gift of life. So if we need colorful stories to give a little bit more attention to what it is that we have in this world, this existence, in a single moment, then we can make as colorful of a folk tale or fantasy or legend or myth as necessary to try and carry some of that value from some other dimension, as the spirit world. All of that has been washed away with the domination of one truth and one morality. And so I buck against it all of the time.
And so do I, in a way. But now I'm more suspicious of it, because what bothers me is I wonder, do I reject things because I reject them intellectually, because I reject them rationally, as I would like to think? Or do I reject them because they don't paint me in a light that I appreciate? And I recoil from them because they bruise the very ego that I should seek to undermine. And I think it's a creeping thought that once you start having it, like it really bothers you, because I think we have a way of, we're very good at rationalizing desires, and very good at building justifications for our desires that run contrary to our deepest instincts about their true nature. So, like, for instance, when I was a godless heathen, so to speak, which I still to a certain degree am, but when I was more so one in my teenage years, I used to be really seduced by whatever my understanding of Epicureanism was. I used to think that was the ticket, hedonism. But Epicureanism seemed to me more noble than hedonism, because it had a sense of appreciation for the pleasures of life, which was more than just like a mindless consumption of things. So whatever, that was my justification for my gluttony and my love of sex and my my running through life, just concerned about my own pleasure. I didn't see anything wrong with it, because I was very good at finding reasons to justify it, reasons that didn't hold up to further, harsher analysis. Less interested in my own pleasure, more interested again in this idea of salvation. That so that's one thing that we should keep in mind. What motivates our rejection of things? And a lot of the times we'll find that it's not reason, it's instinct, or it's something which cries for some sort of pleasure that's being denied.
I think we've come a long way from recognizing the merits of instinct, and all of that has been shaped with the transition into a Christian world. So beginning with Socrates' question, unraveling all the threads that had bound Athenians together, and then on towards some of the relinquishing of life that Christ had generated. We've constructed a world that we feel like we need to categorize and rationalize and dissect every different aspect of our reality. And that in itself has been problematic. So many different notions spring to mind in this. I mean, whether it's a matter of how we regard time, the difference between Bergson and Einstein in how we regard experience, how we measure our experiences. But so coming back around, we I think we do need to make the distinction between our tendency for a religious experience is in a category of mysteries that we must leave alone to an extent. What I mean by that is appreciate the experiences for what they are, and whether we see it as seeking either salvation or silence, as in the way that we're talking about it, we do recognize some tendency to quelling some of the tumult of our experience. And maybe that's part of this temporal push, being towards death, that we recognize we need to understand these experiences while we can. And I can appreciate the merits of Epicurus, and in fact, the point you were bringing up about what is more difficult or less difficult is a good parameter to gauge some of these things, because the difference between Epicureanism and hedonism is itself a fairly large divide. As he's remembered for being more wild than he was. I mean, he would just appreciate having a little bit of cheese, with his breath.
Exactly. Yeah. So what I was saying was, Epicureanism in itself might have all sorts of virtues, but I wasn't looking at those. I was just using it as a justification of my gluttony. You know what I mean? Which is not the way Epicureans would have used it. I could also see a pathological use of Christianity to justify the pleasure you get in being morally superior to others, or self-righteous, or condemning. And you could use that as a justification for that pernicious pleasure. Missing the whole point of Christianity, much like I missed the whole point of Epicureanism at the time. So I think that's the way I was saying it. Your spiritualizations of your or your intellectual justifications for those things which aren't really all that worthy tend to be quite empty and shallow iterations of that. I think that the Christianity that you use to justify your own moral righteousness is a shallow Christianity. The Epicureanism that you use to justify your sloth and gluttony is a shallow Epicureanism. That's more the way I was thinking about it.
Well, as we assess what is more difficult or less difficult from across these different doctrines and dogmas, I would argue that the values from these different pagan cultures, now whether this arises from the Hellenic world or Celtic, Nordic, whichever of the more of the pagan beliefs, I believe those are more challenging than that road towards righteousness, right? There's always Christ to carry you along that beach. There's there's always forgiveness for every different thing deemed as sin. What's harder is to live one's own philosophy. So you might take a list of virtues from the Nicomachean Ethics, and if that was one's commandments and one sought to live by them, that's going to be a lot more challenging than preaching one thing while contradicting in behavior. And that's where the multitude of truths and all of the different values that one might derive from a particular folk's cultural history is more immediately relevant and therefore more healthful and more beneficial to their people. And that maybe brings us back around towards cultural identification, because we are spanned across the world in having branched to as many peoples and languages and dialects that it can be difficult to associate with a particular culture. If you didn't grow up at, coming back to Jung, if you didn't grow up among Buddhists, why would you go and adopt their faith? That's a very big question that the world has not confronted. Is the mega churches across Asia are probably some of the largest centers for Christian worship, and I always wonder, what would their ancestors think of their new faith?
I don't think they'd be pleased with it at all. I don't think they'd be into it at all. But maybe I don't. It's very difficult. It's the migrations of one's religious sort of loyalties is a very difficult and treacherous path to confront on your own. Like, I think if you're going to attempt something like that, you should be reading as much as you possibly can on the subject. Like, you should be really involved intellectually in comparative religion, comparative mythology, psychology, theology, philosophy. Like, it's a whole thing. Like, don't do it haphazardly if you're going to attempt it, is what I guess I'm saying. But I was struck by what you said about the Nicomachean Ethics. Like, if you took those as your commandments, it'd be very. Were you saying that they'd be more difficult to adhere to than religious commandments? Is that how you meant it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Because go ahead, please.
I see how that could be true, but in a way, I think that's not true, because religious Nicomachean ethics the virtues are very well argued for. You can see why they want you to be that. He makes a very good case for those virtues that you have very good reason to believe, and you can believe them rationally, and so to follow something that you understand rationally, I think, is more difficult than following something that you don't understand at all. That takes faith. I don't think it takes faith to try to follow the commandments of Nicomachean ethics. So that's one difficulty. There's one challenge that I noticed. The second thing is, that's mostly it. It reminds me of Kierkegaard and in Fear and Trembling, when he tells of the difference between Agamemnon and Abraham. He says both are stories that feature a father that has to kill a child, but they're not at all the same story, because in the case of Agamemnon, he's trying to appease Diana so she'll send the winds that he needs to sail off to Troy. The decision to kill Iphigenia is fit within a moral rationale of obedience to the gods and their will for the sake of the polis and the city. So that makes total sense. Like it's not something that it's something that anyone involved in the Greek world can see as virtuous and approve of, and any onlooker could understand what was going on. But the case of Abraham is very different, because he's given a private commandment and a private covenant, one which contradicted all of the laws that he thought he was living by. You shouldn't kill, that Isaac would be the promised son of Israel, that he would have a great future. All of these things seem to be contradicted. All of his morality is contradicted in this. And yet he walks on, ever more resolute. And he draws his knife, prepared to follow through. And Kierkegaard says that's why he's not just one story amongst others, but he's the shining light that guides the anguished. That's what he says of Abraham. Because he says there's no way of interpreting his actions other than through faith, which is intensely irrational and is all about seeking the mysterious, seeking the union with that which is mysterious. So I think that's the first thing that came to mind about your comment. The second thing that came to mind was the pitfall of virtue is to seek to feel virtuous as opposed to make any others benefit from your virtue. The self contemplation, the light coming out of your hair, the kindness in your heart, these angelic visions of self that accompany the moral pleasure of being virtuous, I think are a big pitfall. And you see that for me, like in identity politics all the time, these contests of virtue that are quite disgusting to watch, I think is one of the pathologies of seeking virtues through it. Like, why do you seek them? To be virtuous, or for others to benefit from your virtue? I think that's what you should think of when you pursue virtues. So those are the two things that come to mind.
And it's worth examining. It certainly is. I don't, in fact, preach a particular set of virtues. I mean to encourage, with the book I've published, I mean to encourage individuals to find what it is that they find most helpful and beneficial to their lives, to raise themselves up, standing in the light, growing taller, so that any state can benefit from greater individual responsibility. So the encouragement towards self-mastery is going to begin at home, and it's going to have positive repercussions.
Zarathustra. You're quite Zarathustran. You strike me as quite Zarathustran in your ideals.
Yeah, it's certainly, it's certainly in that category. And I love the distinction that we're making between Agamemnon and Abraham. I'm thinking now of a contrast between when we're talking about faith, and you talk about the faith of Abraham, and then you might compare that to the faith of Job, and with a pagan parallel, seeing Odysseus's continued suffering as somewhat parallel to Job's. There's a distinction in what Job is putting faith in and what Odysseus is putting faith in. And that, I think, speaks to some of the rationalizations that might support Agamemnon's sacrifice versus Abraham's. But everything that is beyond this world beyond sight or sense, is going to require a degree of faith, and there it becomes necessary to make distinctions against rationalism at the same time as making distinctions against mysticism. And a phrase I use in the book is as both reverie and reason as sail and ballast to navigate these waters. And so that a sail is filling with the wind, an element that one might trust to carry them in the direction that they mean to steer themselves. That serves, and it requires a ballast beneath the ship to not turn over as swells rise and fall. But all of that, just sailing as a category, is itself an example of how it is more challenging to help oneself than to have faith in an omniscient God redeeming that individual. So it's not that I mean to just dust off some set of values from a different culture to replace ones after the fall of religion. Instead, to look towards the underlying meaning that we find so fulfilling. And I think that's where we find an accord, in our conversation here, where there is a reverence for those transcendent moments. It's difficult to put into words, to communicate those thought pictures from one mind to another, but those experiences themselves have been in the category of religion and spirituality, and then become a little bit more problematic for all of the complications that arise from their institutionalization and as they start to become their own dogmas.
Yeah. No, you're right. But that's something that I've always found very difficult, because I've never been religious in the institutional side. I never go to church. I don't participate in ritual. And so my spiritual journey is one which seems to me at times a little vapid, because it's not put into practice. I don't know. I have no incentive in the community that I live in to be in true accords with my ideals, and I suffer from that. So I come to crave a little bit of institution. I come to see it as valuable, and want to move in the direction of going to church and partaking in the rituals and helping out communities, things like that. But I could also see if you're on the other side of that fence, and all you've known were institutions and never approached it as a mystical endeavor or a spiritual endeavor at all, but just as a social one, then you come to see it as rigid and standing in the way of your desires and of your ambitions and of your lust for life. So I think there's a balance to be struck, that your religion as institution be fruitful and not oppressive. And that's how, I guess that's about the parishes you belong to. Like, that's a very parochial problem, because who's to say there are communities that are thriving and that are full of goodwill and people who are grateful for their life and their daily bread. And there are megachurches that worship money under the guise of Jesus, it's really about where you live. It's really, so it's hard to say. It's hard to say how to strike that balance correctly. And where are all these good people? And is there like a church equivalent of Yelp written by sensible people? Is there like
Huh. Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know.
It strikes me as a, mass language, mass religion for a mass of people, and it's always been as necessary as bread and circus. And when we explore what's beyond all of that dogma, we might uncover something a little bit more specific to a smaller group of people. So what I'm thinking of here is the Kalevala for the Finnish people, and the hero Väinämöinen, who has a wonderful journey full of all you might expect from any rustic myth. That itself is a lot more specific to a people, the Finnish, and so I think might guide the Finnish towards something worth venerating, because when we recognize that that inclination towards deification, we should be very careful as to what we do, what we venerate, and why, and whether we place greater value in ourselves or something beyond ourselves, and whether that is in the category of worshiping life, or worshiping death, or worshiping the cycle of renewal. And it's so thoroughly a Christian world that we don't recognize it. We don't even, the world doesn't seem to, when I say the world, I mean the majority of the population that holds on to this faith after the death of God because of its psychological underpinnings, the things that have held true. All of that is still being sorted through, and the same things, the things that we're talking about, where we've studied this subject or that in exploring kind of the rubble in from deconstruction. We ourselves set out to make sense of it all. And I guess the main point is just we need to take care in what we venerate and why, because that itself will lead towards either more health or more death.
Well, it's what David Foster Wallace said. If you worship money, you'll feel poor. If you worship intelligence, you'll feel stupid. Like if you worship anything other than transcendent love, you're going awry, because it always leads down something shallow, something vain. I think there's something to that one who venerates the laws of nature fancies himself a magician. One who venerates I don't know, there's a pitfall in there. And the final pitfall for me is always pride. To enjoy your understanding of profound things too much, and to profess to people as if you were some great, the great Merlin.
Yeah.
There's something valuable in knowing those things, not valuable in beckoning forth admiration for knowing those things. Uh, so, yeah, one should be careful of that.
Yeah. In that list of contrast, I come to think of some of Heraclitus's dualisms and how Nietzsche would take a hammer to everything in an effort towards being more constructive than just Socratic argument. But when one raises those contrasts, worshiping money, you'll feel poor, and then arriving at anything other than fill in the blank, you're wrong, is tricky territory because there's little argument against transcendent love. Who in their right mind would argue against that sweeping category? It at least
a lot of people, believe me. In philosophy, a heck of a lot of people. I could the first person that comes to mind is the physicalist, and he would say there is no such thing as transcendent things. What you call love is some electrochemical reaction in the brain that compels you to breed. And if you were smart, you'd learn how to hack your brain and your habits so as to do more productive things than concern yourself on such old and barren sentimentalities. Like, I can imagine that dude jumping at
these are spoken from people who have not felt love or felt transcendence in any form. So it's becomes a difficult thing to argue when one hasn't had an experience that they can relate to or understand. But what was the latter point you were making? It was following on that.
Oh, sorry. Interrupted you. Yeah.
Well, yeah.
Is that what's? Can I see your tattoo better?
Oh,
I'm curious about it.
Well, this is actually.
Oh wow! Is that Cronus, or is that Socrates?
It is actually a Baroque adaptation of Odin and his Ravens, done by a colleague of mine who I'd studied with. Yeah, it's after a sculpture actually from a church in Venice of Titian. So it's a strange nexus of a number of different influences. But
so you like this? If I'm not mistaken, maybe I might be confusing two myths. One myth is when he's swinging from the tree, and he learns about the runes in these deep waters, and the other one is when he sacrifices an eye in exchange for a drink from the waters at the roots of Yggdrasil, right? Is that the latter myth that's being depicted?
Oh, this is a bit more of a summary in itself. So it's not depicting either of those tales. Either having hanged himself for those 9 days on Yggdrasil, or visiting Mimir as well, which is it's one of the reasons why there are so many different stories to paint, and to some degree, I've abided intuition towards some stories over others, and it provides a lot of reflection, and there's there's so much to unpack from any given myth that each of them are worth their retelling and worth every reader or listener in interpreting what it means to them in their life and their world. And so, and actually, in as a category of sacrifice, and where we had spoken a bit about self-abnegation in Christianity, its relation towards some Buddhism, and making a distinction from the old religions. Odin, having sacrificed himself on the world tree or the axis mundi, carries some of the similar ideas for a more northerly and hardy people. And it's a sacrifice that benefits the people and in a way that empowers them rather than shames them. So one of the differences, I think, between Christ's crucifixion and Odin's sacrifice is it's in empowering the folk to derive a little bit more from their existence here and now, as opposed to forgiving them for having been. But perhaps that's it's getting a little bit.
No, I get it. I get what you're saying. You strike me as very Nietzschean in your mind. It's an admirable thing as well, Nietzsche, because I think Nietzscheans are people who, as I see it, they want to drink from the marrow of life itself. They don't want intermediaries between themselves and the essence of life. And so they tear them down because they want to drink from the source of it. I think that's what Nietzscheanism is about. But I've always seen a madness in Nietzscheanism, like a Faustian madness in Nietzscheanism. Like I've always there's a profound, when I find myself being too seduced by that, there's an alarm that goes off in my soul that goes like, "Ooh, be careful! you're entering on dangerous. You're entering in dangerous waters." It seems like there's a Nietzschean point of no return that because what you're saying in some sense is I'm going to unmoor myself from the world and from all of the assumptions of everybody else and all of their values. I'm going to find my own path. I'm going to build my own gods, and I'm going to live as intensely as I can, which is a hermit's sensibility. There's an unmooring in untethering in Nietzsche. And I think one can drift too far in the wilderness by themselves. Maybe I'm just afraid to do it. Maybe it's like fear that's holding me back. But there's something in Nietzsche that I see as dangerous, spiritually dangerous.
And he's not a man, he's dynamite, isn't that right? Yeah. I'm curious as to that soul alarm that you mentioned, because it's not the first time that one hears so much caution around Nietzsche. That in itself speaks volumes. I think in his philosophy, and as he has addressed the coming age of nihilism, the age that we're in, that resonates so far across time that it is still very concerning and very alarming. What you generally hear as a caution against reading too much Nietzsche is probably, well, obviously that there are aspects tainted by history as things have gotten misconstrued, as and so we're not entering into that just now. It's not as relevant. Unmooring from a civilization's valuations is where nihilism begins. And for postmodernists, it still is a patchwork that continues to rotate as this endless cipher. But and here's where the greatest challenge, the greatest difficulty of revaluations come in, is having the fortitude and the courage to sail to that horizon. And you had mentioned this sort of event horizon, that in this point of no return. And I think it reflects some of the bravest souls in history, whether venturing out to the open ocean, not knowing either they're going to find land or they're going to find the Jormungandr, the world serpent. It's going to eat them. It's either one or the other. And that's just one example of many shipbuilding, seafaring peoples.
Yeah.
So I'm happy to answer any questions if you think that one goes too far in appreciating the encouragement towards self-mastery that Nietzsche espouses.
Because I think the way I've come to see Nietzsche is he's just the medicine you need when you've become too stale in your dogma, in your following of dogma. I think someone who sees his religious duties as a stale sort of administrative thing, like, right? He needs to read some Nietzsche, that guy. But I think that there's a point at which if you become too embroiled in it, it starts turning like something like almost devilish, like Luciferian, like pride at its highest rapture, like the desire to be a god, the desire to total self-mastery is godhood, as I see it, like total self-mastery. Because what are you mastering? You're mastering the forces of nature, you're mastering reason, you're mastering like your relationship to science and the past, and like there's something titanic about self-mastery, which is appealing, but it's laden with its own sort of pitfalls, I think. So yeah, in all things I believe in balance. Like really, I'm an advocate of balance. I think the middle, like once you've pointed out a meaningful dichotomy, you should strive for the middle of it. Nietzsche intensifies your religious experience because for me it should be geared towards religion, but that's the kind of sensibility I have these days. But Nietzsche can intensify your religious experience by burning away what's not essential about it. I think there's something like that. It's like burning deadwood in a forest, Nietzsche, to me. It's valuable for that reason. But don't just dance in the flames afterwards, like that's basically what I'm getting at.
And I think that's the tendency of postmodernists to dance in the ashes of so much brought to ruin. And I would like to make the distinction between efforts in self-mastery as being entirely a private and personal challenge. And this is so when you mention about mastering elements and like technological, scientific, and global mastery, that's magnitudes more ambitious than just each individual understanding themselves as a human being, thrown into the world. So
know thyself based mastery. You meant it that way. Socratic mastery.
Well, and that has always been an effort towards that. And while Nietzsche isn't the be all end all for in this conversation, the core of his philosophy speaks to the human condition in this way. Is all of that all of that intensity is worth being cautious about. It makes perfect sense to turn the volume down a little bit. And so what are we talking about with the death of God? What does that mean to the little preacher, right? As Nietzsche's upbringing, his father being a pastor in Roken, had a profound psychological his view in philosophy. What we are driving at with that biography and that upbringing is why Nietzsche is so important today, is because unlike any other philosopher, he has delved into the death of God as the death of his personal father, his dad, his dad as preacher dying at his young age. And that's the condition that humanity is in right now, without parentage, spiritual parentage. And the church is kind of bereft of that profundity, and still holds on to some of its teachings for the benefit of coming generations. But once the jar's broken open, it's broken open. And part of what I've come to understand from the psychology extracted from that philosophy is in recognizing what it is to exist in this world, specifically one's relationship to the elements and ancestors. So what I'm driving at in relating the age of nihilism and the death of God to Nietzsche's upbringing, the death of his father, a pastor, and the disillusion of the little preacher, is in recognizing the amount of joy and gratitude one feels personally when you recognize some correlation towards being a son of an earth mother and the son of a sky father. That in itself integrates you into a natural world, a world that is just as mortal as ourselves. And that becomes so much more important than wondering as to how my behaviors might be judged, by some omniscient entity, So I've found a lot of worth in taking up a philosophical hammer, with a point towards constructing.
Yeah, and it's a great task. I did a lot of that too at university, and I enjoyed it a a lot. It was my first entry into philosophy in a way with Nietzsche. I approached it through Sartre, Nietzsche. That was my first sort of point of contact, and I was super into it. But I've come to value other things more, I think, than that. He's no longer to me my prophet, my shepherd. You know, like he lives in me always as a certain voice that cries out at very sort of needed moments. But he's part of a choir now. he's part of. He's part of. I think to conclude here. What do you think?
Yeah, it's been a very very expansive conversation. And perhaps next time we might hear more. I would like to hear more on your channel as to some of those voices in that choir.
Yes. Yeah, we'll get to that. Well, thank you so much for your time, man. I really appreciate it. This was a great conversation. And I suspect we'll have other such conversations at some point. So if you're ever in London, you know, drop me a line. So thanks for your time, man, and speak to you soon.